Hello, everyone. Thank you again for the awesome training that we had this past Tuesday. It was really great to see all the different ways that you collaborated and supported each other. And I'm hopefully looking forward to another great series of collaborative times with you in the near future. So, the purpose of today is for us to kind of quickly go over how to create unit goals. And through this overview, you'll be able to begin writing your own unit goals for the different instructional cycles / unit openers that you created this week. So take a second to peruse our objectives. While we create unit goals, we're going to be thinking about our standards and the conceptual ideas we hope students will build. And we'll craft statements that will support teachers and students in their learning goals for the year. So these are ideas that we want teachers to use in a really productive way to inform the specific learning of their students. It's kind of like a roadmap that we're creating for students and teachers. So take a second to look at the framework for planning conceptual units. Right now, we are really going to focus on the first two components of this spiral. In building unit goals, yes, enduring understandings and essential questions are very critical to that piece. But in addition, we're going to be thinking about some other guiding phrases and statements that will really help teachers and students see the complete picture of what this instructional cycle is going to look like and how they could use their unit opener resources to have the best learning experience possible. So we're going to start today with thinking about some of the universal concepts that you've already planned and attached to an instructional cycle. You're going to see that I'm going to use these words a lot as I build some of my starting in unit goals, such as enduring understandings and essential questions. But as you become more comfortable with building some of these statements, you might find that you put these words into different synonyms, and that's okay. We just want to make sure that all of our unit goals go back to this concept because the concepts were anchored in our academic standards. So some of you have asked, what do you mean by unit goals? So when I say unit goals, I mean as broad as a universal concept and as narrow as a guiding question. We're going to take some time to review what each of these mean, and then we're going to talk about how we actually are going to create them. And you're going to see a real life example of how I would create these goals if I were sitting in your shoes. This is the same process that we took as we were, we used as we were creating unit starters. And it's a process that is really hard to perfect, probably because it was never meant to be perfected by any individual. It's a learning process, so give yourself some grace to make some mistakes. I promise you that you will see me make plenty of mistakes as I create some of the unit goals for this example unit that we have. So cut yourself some slack. You deserve to kind of learn this process while also making some mistakes. So it's all good. All right, so if we go back to our second grade example, we can take some time to read the standards. If you need to read these standards, go ahead and press pause on the video and take time to read it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, pause. So if you look at these standards, you'll notice that the overview really gives a great idea of what this concept might be about. So students will explore the concept of democracy. That's a pretty great concept for a social studies unit. But if we're thinking about ELA, and if I'm thinking about universal concepts, I may want to get a little bit broader to make sure that I can make connections across contents and across grades. So reading the overview at the top of your social studies or science strands will be a great place for you to start. But it will not necessarily give you the final universal concept or unit concept that you're looking for. It takes a little bit more thinking. So we've chosen in this example 2 focus standards, which are circled here in green, and I'm going to keep those in mind. I'm also going to keep in mind what were some of those universal concepts that really spoke to me as I read these standards. So if you haven't had a chance to read the standards, you really are going to want to. So I'm going to give you another chance to pause for just a second so that you can read these standards in depth and think about which universal concepts most connect with this government and civics strand. Now that you've had a second to read, In my thinking, I see that some of the concepts that really relate are the concepts of structure and relationships. So, a democracy is a structure that government and people use in order to basically meet their needs. Relationships are embedded within that structure because, the Congress works with the Senate, the president works with the House of Representatives and the Senate. I mean, there's lots of relationships just on the government side, but there's also relationships that we have. Anybody about to pay their taxes? That's a specific relationship we have with our government structure. So if I'm trying to think through that lens of what are all the different concepts and connections I can make, I really think I would probably land on structure and relationships. So you might notice that in these 10 universal concepts, there are other connections that we can make. We could probably make a case for pattern and power to be a part of these universal concepts for this instructional cycle. We could also make a case that systems would be connected. And there's nothing wrong with you trying out a few of these concepts as you draft the goals. But since you've already tied yourself to a concept in the instructional planning cycles, stick with those first. And if something just doesn't seem right, it'd be a good time for you to talk with your team leader to possibly discuss changing some of those concepts that you originally planned. So, take a moment to read the definition of a universal concept. It's a concept that bridges all disciplinary and grade level boundaries. That's a really important distinction for this part of the unit goal creation. This is going to be a sentence or phrase that bridges all disciplines, all contents, and can be connected grade after grade after grade. So in order to do that, we're going to have to think really broad. So if I were to use the word democracy in a universal concept, would that allow my students to think broadly about a topic? No. They would think about social studies. So I want to think even broader, even higher, more higher level than even the word democracy. So let's take a second to watch how I would create this universal concept based off the words that I chose and some of the conversations that I might have had with my peers about this instructional cycle. So you're going to use the word created during the instructional cycle, and you're going to craft a broad statement or phrase that encompasses the entire content strand. So I've decided on the two words, relationships and structure. I want to give a little bit more meat just because there's so many relationships and structures that I don't want to be too broad that my students could just go anywhere with this or teachers could just go anywhere with this. So I'm going to think about crafting a phrase, structure requires relationships. Relationships with what? Among people. People are in the U.S. government. Places and things. I don't love how elementary that sounds. I want this to be sophisticated. So I'm going to reread it a couple of times and think about ways I could revise it. Structure requires relationships among people, places, and things. So structure requires relationships among nouns. I like to think bigger. Structures require relationships. I could honestly just leave it at structures require relationships. And then I could fill in the specific relationships that are needed as I get more detailed about the structures that I'm talking about. So for right now, I'm going to leave it as structures require relationships. That seems really easy, but you'll notice that the only thing that I did was add the word requires. A lot of times your universal concept is going to barely flesh out the initial concept word that you used or tagged with your instructional strategy, and that's okay. So now let's think about the second step, building a unit concept. So this is the application of the universal concept to the specific discipline. So for the example on this slide, it's science. But for our example, we're talking about government and civics for second graders. So that overview at the top of the strand gave us a word that's going to be really important for this next step. And the word is democracy. A democracy is a certain structure that has and requires relationships. So I'm going to start to substitute some of those words like structure in order to help my students to hone their sophisticated and specific understanding about the discipline. So on this next step, use the phrase or sentence created in the universal concept and flesh it out even more. Use more content vocabulary as you would find in the actual standards. So just like I said, the word democracy was something that was a part of the actual content strand. I also saw words about laws, the Constitution. These are all words that I may consider when I'm thinking about a unit concept, but it still needs to be a little bit broad. So I'm going to go back to look at the third grade example. The universal concept was differences in scale. Here we talk about distance from the sun and affects planets' distinguishing characteristics. So we see the word like sun and planets. Those are some of those content vocabulary words. So it's not so specific that I'm totally rehashing out my standard, but it's connected enough for a teacher to know, I see why they put that as a focus standard or what strand I'm using in this integrated ELA unit. So let's try this out. My universal was structures require relationships. Okay? So if I think about a unit concept, I want it to be a little bit more discipline specific. So democracy is the structure, and democracy, I guess I could talk about all democracies, require relationships among its people, because there's people in a democracy, its systems. That's another concept word that I'm going to bring in. And this might be a point where I say, in the previous instructional cycle, I've already talked about systems, and my students are going to have some background knowledge. So using some other concept words isn't always a bad thing, especially when you've already built some prior knowledge about it. So democracies require relationships among its people, its systems, and its, is there anything else that I need to put in this kind of collection of relationships that I'm describing? There's people at many different levels in a democracy, and there's systems at many different levels. There's government systems, there's laws, there's symbols. Democracies require, I don't know if democracies require relationships among their symbols. So maybe I should change this really strong word to democracies have relationships among its peoples, its system, and its symbols, because that's a part of this second grade standard. But it's still something that's broad enough that doesn't tell me everything I want to know. I'm going to read it again. Democracies have relationships among its people, its systems, and its symbols. I'm going to leave it and see how it goes. All right, I'm going to carry that with me as I kind of continue moving. So now we're going to focus on enduring understandings. Some people think that this is the hardest part of the unit goals, and it's because you want to second guess yourself. I'm going to go ahead and give a little bit of a direction about the creation of these unit goals. I want you to do your first one on your own. When Aaron and I, my partner and someone who I really care and respect a whole lot, we're sitting down to write out the unit goals for the newest unit starter, we started doing it as a team. And what I found myself feeling was I was really self-conscious about what she might think about my unit goals, because I didn't know if they were the same or if they even needed to be the same. So I finally had to say, hey, Aaron, I want to try doing these on my own first, and then I want to come to the table and have a conversation with you. There's totally nothing wrong in making that statement now, and I'm actually just going to go ahead and make it for you. Because you're teachers and you're working with teachers you may or may not know, take some time to write some unit goals on your own and specific to something that you're going to be kind of in charge of. So if you've got 6 instructional cycles and you're working in a team of 2, everybody take a turn at 1 instructional cycle. And that way you might feel a little bit more comfortable about trying these unit goals out on your own. So let's think about the enduring understandings. These are the ideas we want students to understand, not just recall, from deep exploration of our unit. So these understandings reflect the abstract, easily misunderstood big ideas of the discipline. I think a few things that are really important here is the thought of not just recall. These are not a list of facts that we want students to be able to recite by the end of the unit. But these are also not these hugely obscure statements that students will never get. We want them to be relatable enough that students can use them to guide their conversation. And teachers are going to want to use these statements to help them whenever there's a statement or idea that can be easily misunderstood among students. So these are statements that think big, connect the universal and unit concept, and start to lead into the actual exploration of the unit. So we'll come back to this graphic when we talk about the next part, but let's get started on our enduring understandings. So we're going to craft 2 to 5 enduring understandings, thinking about our previous 2 unit goals. These are going to be written in declarative sentences, and they're going to really broadly outline the content strand, but they're going to allow for real-world connections as well. The best suggestion I can give you as you start to write these enduring understandings is just to try it out. It takes some time, but give yourself some grace as you really start to craft some of these statements. Some of them may sound a little silly at first. That's okay. Some of mine that I'm about to write are probably going to sound a little silly and maybe even a little romantic, but that's okay. I've got to kind of flesh out my ideas in order to get to the right one. So I'm going to paste over my previous 2 unit goals. I've got the universal concept and the unit concept. Structures require relationships. And then my unit concept, democracies have relationships among its people, its systems, and its symbols. I'm a pretty black and white parallel type of thinker when it comes to building unit goals. So if ever I see that I have a series of connections that I can make with my unit concept, I may want to flesh that out in my enduring understanding. Otherwise, I may reveal what some of the big components of the study are in my enduring understanding. So for the enduring understandings, I'm going to try and focus on people, systems, and symbols. So for the first one, democracies have relationship among its people. I want to get a little more content specific. So I might say Americans are related to the democracy through the U.S. Constitution. Okay. I'm going to let that one rest for just a second. Sorry, I can't spell very well. Let me see the next one. Americans are related to the democracy through the U.S. Constitution. How can they be related? How can systems be related? A democracy has many systems that guide its people and the inner workings of a government. Okay, but still let that one rest. I'm just going to dump out my ideas first. And then finally, democracy related to symbols. A democracy is exemplified by the symbols democracy is exemplified by the symbols. So my symbols in my unit this time are the Statue of Liberty, Mount Rushmore. Our democracy is related. I'm going to change exemplified to related. Democracy is related to its symbols by the characteristics they exemplify. Characteristics. That would be a word that they would have talked about as second graders. A democracy is related to its symbols by the characteristics they exemplify. By the characteristics and values. Values is something that I would think about if I'm talking about a unit on America. Democracy is related to its symbols by the characteristics and values they exemplify. Exemplify. That word is driving me nuts a little bit. Democracy is related to its symbols by the characteristics and values they... I'll come back to it. I'm going to start at the top and work my way forward. So when I say start at the top, I'm literally going to go back to the standards, read them for another time, and think about, do these work? Are these going to be statements that actually help students understand this content strand? So I've got right now, Americans are related to the democracy through the U.S. Constitution. My next question is, how? So I'm going to go up to the standards and think about that for just a moment. So Americans are related by the U.S. Constitution. I see laws through the Constitution through Tennessee, but I'm talking about the specific state. So maybe Americans, well, Tennesseans are Americans, so I think that I'm okay with that connection. It's talking about the consequence. It's talking about the responsibilities, protect its citizens' right to vote, describe the fundamental principles of American democracy, including equality, fair treatment, and respect of property of others. I'm going to keep going to see if I've made the right connections here. So Americans are related to the democracy. Maybe I need to change. No, I talk about the U.S. Constitution. So as you can see, this is almost like an open dialogue that you're having with your brain as you create these enduring understandings. Americans are related to the democracy through the U.S. Constitution. Because of the many standards that enduring understanding will support, I'm going to leave it as is. I've got both of my concept words embedded within that statement. I've got democracy and structure. I've got relationships with related. So that makes me feel really good. I want my concept words to be in my enduring understandings. I'm going to move on to the second one. A democracy has many systems that guide its people and the inner workings of a government. So I used the word systems in my unit concept. I want to start to flesh out what that system actually is, but not too... Sorry. I just had a phone call. I want to flesh out what those systems are to an extent, but I don't want to get so specific that I get into the discipline understandings and the guiding questions. So a democracy has many systems that guide its people and the inner workings of government. I could talk about many different people. I could talk about immigrants. I could talk about the laws and the consequences as they're broken. So, I'm good with the people and the inner workings of a government. That could lead me to talk about the three branches, which is part of the standards. It could lead me to talk about the U.S. Constitution. And this could also really support the idea of Tennessee, because this one doesn't necessarily talk about Americans. Okay, a democracy is related to its symbols by the characteristics and values they exemplify. That was really a part of the unit overview for this strand. Democracy is related to its symbols by the characteristics and values they exemplify. I've got related, I've got structure, I've got symbols, which is part of the standards. Could this statement be used to describe many different things? But just democracy is related to its symbols by the characteristics and values they exemplify. I honestly can't think of any other way that I would word these. So I'm going to move on, but I know that I may come back and change these if I need to. All right. So now that I have some enduring understandings crafted, I'm going to start to think about some big questions that are open-ended and will guide students' exploration of these enduring understandings. So you see here that this question, why is it important to understand the special path or orbit of each planet, is very open-ended. These essential questions should not be able to be answered by one word, by two words, by three words. They should be able to be answered over continuous discussion after being posed to students over multiple different lessons. So as you think about these essential questions, You're going to use your enduring understandings to guide the big ideas, but you also want to think about how easily can this question be answered? Not because all we want to do is make learning hard for students, but we don't want to make it so simple that the conversations die after the first read of a text. We want the conversations to last and span over the course of a unit. So, for this example, or for this step, and I apologize for the typo, it says craft 2 to 4 essential questions. It could be 2 to 5. We're going to think about the enduring understandings and create 2 to 5 big questions that are open-ended and can be answered in multiple settings. It's a personal preference that however many enduring understandings I have, I like to have the same number of essential questions. Because as teachers read these content goals, they're going to naturally think about, this is my understanding, how do I get there? Hence the essential question. So, as I move on to the example, I'm going to paste these content goals as they're written. And I'm going to do a little bit of formatting so that you can see my type A personality just a little bit. Sometimes I like to write my enduring understandings in the same line, or I like to write my essential questions in the same line as my enduring understandings. So I may even change the text color just a little bit. Americans are related to the democracy through the U.S. Constitution. How are Americans related to their democracy through the U.S. Constitution? So what did I do here? I literally just put a question stem at the front. I encourage you to use this thinking as you go throughout the creation of your own essential questions, because it's going to get you comfortable in thinking about bold statement, big question, and they're going to be really interchangeable. So a democracy has many systems that guide its people and the inner workings of a government. So this one has a little bit more meat to it. So I might have to break this down into a couple of questions, which is fine. So here I'm going to think about what systems in a democracy guide people within the democracy? How do systems guide the inner workings of a government or democracy? What systems in a democracy guide people within the democracy? I've already said democracy once, so I'm going to take that first one out. What systems guide people within a democracy? Then how do systems guide the inner workings of a government or a democracy? I think it's really up to you if you think that government and democracy should be there together or if they should just be there separate. I'm going to add government because that's part of the standards and it adds just kind of another layer of discussion, because we may possibly read a text that specifically talks about a city government, or we may read a text that talks about the United States democracy. So there's 2 essential questions that I have for this one enduring understanding. That's going to happen sometimes because some of these understandings are going to be really meaty. So if I look at my third statement, a democracy is related to its symbols by the characteristics and values they exemplify. Let me think. A democracy is related to its symbols. Why do certain symbols exemplify the values of a democracy? Why do certain symbols exemplify the values of a democracy? I always like to have a how and a why question in my enduring understandings. To you, it may sound better to put how do certain symbols exemplify the values of a democracy. It's really a matter of teacher preference. But for me, I feel like this could be a really good way for students to explain why a certain symbol exemplifies the values, because they're going to have to attach it to specific reasoning embedded within a text, and they're going to have to attach it to certain thinking and synthesizing across text. So I'm going to use that word why. Let me change it to my color scheme here. And now I'm going to reread all of them once I reformat it. Essential questions. There. Okay. Now let's get to focusing on all of these statements as a whole. So, if I think about these statements, I should be able to read them and pivot off of each understanding with each question. They really should be parallel, and they should work together in order to build super strong depths of knowledge within our students as we go throughout this unit. So, I'm going to read them out loud and see how they connect. Americans are related to the democracy through the U.S. Constitution. How are Americans related to their democracy through the U.S. Constitution? A democracy has many systems that guide its people and the inner workings of a government. What systems guide people within the democracy? How do systems guide the inner workings of a government or democracy? In question 3, a democracy is related to its symbol by the characteristics and values they exemplify. Why do certain symbols exemplify the values of a democracy? I might add here some symbols more than others because there's lots of symbols as we look at the United States, but you're going to be focusing on certain ones, and certain symbols are more important to others than they are maybe to the rest of the world. And that might be a path of thinking that we could follow with our students. All right, so I've got a huge chunk of my unit goals complete when I get done with my essential questions. Now I have an opportunity to think even more specific about the content goals as I get to the guiding questions and discipline understandings. So let's finish this and wrap this up. Disciplinary understandings are the specific ideas and specialized vocabulary of the discipline. These ideas will focus instruction and build disciplinary knowledge and provide the schema to organize and anchor new word learning. Guiding questions are still open-ended questions, so we shouldn't be getting yes-no answers as we ask these questions. But they guide the disciplinary understandings and the exploration within the content strand. So, these are going to be statements that we build, again, parallel with each other. I'm going to use the content goals that I've already created, but I'm going to think about what are some new ideas and words that I could include that will really help my students understand and start to grapple with this content strand in this ELA unit of study. So, the text keeps getting smaller and smaller. Discipline understandings. Unlike enduring understandings and essential questions, you don't have to have the same number of discipline understandings as you do enduring understandings. You really just want them to be a little bit broad so that students can kind of focus on the major buckets in their inquiry for the unit. So disciplinary understandings. Americans are related. I'm going to go back and read enduring understandings. Americans are related to the democracy through the U.S. Constitution. This is going to be a time where I really want to start to bring out the laws of the Constitution so that we can start talking about the positive and negative relationships with the people and the laws. So the U.S. Constitution protects people through specific laws, provides responsibilities for each citizen, and what else does the U.S. Constitution do? If I think about how the system guides people, how the system guides the inner workings of the government, I could still think about the protection of people, the responsibilities of people. So do I have enough? Do I need a third area here? I'm going to reread it as it is. The U.S. Constitution protects people through specific laws and provides responsibilities for each citizen. That really goes to what these standards talk about. So I'm just going to leave it at these two more narrowed focus points. So the other only part that I haven't included in the understandings and questions is this idea of symbols. Let's think about what these symbols may be. I'm going to get specific, and I'm going to say the Statue of Liberty, Mount Rushmore, and let's see what the other examples are. Mount Rushmore, White House, Bald Eagle. I'm going to include all of those in this example of the disciplinary understandings. The Statue of Liberty, Mount Rushmore, the White House, and the Bald Eagle symbolize specific values of the U.S. democracy, of the United States. Okay, so both of these statements beg the question of how. How do these symbols kind of exemplify the values of the United States? How does the U.S. Constitution protect people with specific laws and provide specific responsibilities? So I've really already gone to my final step in my content goals, my guiding questions. So we've talked about guiding questions that they're still open-ended, but they're more narrow in focus that they could possibly provide a specific lesson sequence on their own. So if I talk about the protections of a U.S. citizen, I may read some texts that talk about why the laws were created in the U.S. Constitution and what specific laws were created that protect citizens, thinking about maybe the right to own a gun or the right to have property. I'm not really savvy right now on all the different laws that are in the U.S. Constitution, but you get my point. So as I start to draft this final part, yay, I made it a little smaller. That's a little easier for you. I'm going to think about how I can use similar structures with the enduring understandings and essential questions with my guiding questions. So, guiding questions. My first one, the U.S. Constitution protects people. So, I'm going to think, how does the U.S. Constitution protect people with laws? And then I'm going to break it down a little more. How does the U.S. Constitution provide responsibilities among its citizens, for each citizen? Okay, I've really covered that first discipline understanding. So let's think about the second one. The Statue of Liberty, Mount Rushmore, the White House, and the Bald Eagle symbolize specific values of the United States. I'm going to generalize this one just a little bit more because I want it to be open-ended. What values are exemplified by the symbols of the United States? Okay. So, after a little bit of thinking, drafting, possibly deliberating, you're probably going to experience some writing, deleting, and that's okay. You notice I did very similarly as I was creating these content goals. And you might change some of these content goals once we get to writing our end of unit task in May. But the moral of the story is to give it a try and follow this format so that we can have a broad to narrow focus for our students and teachers. I will email this presentation with you once you access the video. That way you can go back to it over and over again as needed. The last slide in this webinar presentation is a revised schedule of some of the next steps. So because this video is going to take a little bit of time to get to you because it's kind of long because I talk too much, and because we didn't have time to talk about unit goals on Tuesday, here are some of the newly revised next steps that you will see. You see that nobody's going to need your unit goals until May 8th. So please email the unit goals to your team leader and to myself so that we can start to craft some feedback that will best support you and your team members. On May 14th, we're still going to be meeting together for a half-day training at the central office, and we're going to focus on end-of-unit task and rubric creation. And May 16th is when we'll open up the period for feedback from teachers on the unit goals and the anchor units for semester 1. So we're still in a really good place. I really appreciate all the work that y'all have done. Look forward to seeing your instructional cycles that you're typing up. And please reach out if you have any questions. Talk to you soon.